Good morning. Sorry this is taking a minute to get recorded and posted, but we're going to start off with sectional conflict, aka the causes of the Civil War. So we're starting out with slavery and westward expansion. You have a timeline of events here to refer to because I didn't ask you to do the timeline for the vocabulary assignment this chapter since there's 2 chapters. I thought I'd give you guys a break. So we're looking at probably around 1850 to 1861 in this particular chapter. We won't look at like battles or anything like that until the Civil War chapter, and I'll probably post that lecture tomorrow or Wednesday so that you have it. So first of all, we're going to look at several of the compromises that were enacted to in an effort to support slavery and anti-slavery sentiments in the North. So the Wilmot Proviso is one of the very first documents that proposed that any territory gained from Mexico, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist. This is one of the very first documents that says, we're going to stop the spread of slavery at this point. John C. Calhoun actually counters the Wilmot Proviso and says that states own these territories and the Congress and, the federal government have no right to ban slavery there. He says political revolution, anarchy, and civil war would surely erupt if the North failed to heed Southern concerns. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. The balance of representation in Congress between Northerners and Southerners was going to be at risk if they did not allow slavery to exist in these new territories. And so, Northerners would have the upper hand in Congress while Southerners would kind of be left to determine to make decisions with few representatives in government. So that was obviously not very, good for the Southerners. So your Missouri Compromise line is here. You have all this new territory that you've just gotten. So the slavery is not supposed to exist above this line, right? But according to the Wilmot Proviso, this territory here would all be free. So you're taking out a large section of territory that could potentially be slave and giving more territories to the North to upset the balance of the slave and free states. Up until 1837, we had a nice balance. There were 13 slave states and 13 free states. Things start to change around this time, especially whenever we start organizing some of this unorganized territory from the Louisiana Purchase. So each new territory would get to decide for themselves whether or not they wanted to permit slavery according to popular sovereignty. Basically, instead of allowing the government to decide, we're going to allow the people who live in those states or those territories to decide if they want to have slavery or not. Northerners thought more Northerners would come settle new territories and ban slavery anyway, so they supported it. And Southerners basically thought the same thing. They were like, you know what? The Northerners think they can get there first, but guess what? We're going to beat them to it. So that creates more division. Popular sovereignty is a nice compromise. It's a nice solution for the time, but it's not going to work out the way that everybody wants it to. So the development of a new party also kind of creates some division, is created from some division in the Whig and the Democrat Party. Unfortunately, the Free Soil Party doesn't really last very long, but this is all because of people who oppose slavery in the new territories. So these people who oppose the slavery in the new territories, they want free soil in the Western territories. They believe that slavery is immoral and they want to preserve the Western territories for white farmers. And so if you have slavery in these new territories, then you're going to have a lot less jobs or opportunities for white farmers or white poor people who need jobs, and it's going to hurt the economy. So people who are free, they're not going to be able to find jobs very easily because most of these plantation owners or people who are farming are already going to have work that they've bought and paid for. So the Free Soil Party's slogan is free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. So now we're getting to the election of 1848. You have a Democrat, a Free Soiler, and a Whig all running against each other. So the Democrat Party is split, and so more people support the Whigs this time. The Whigs are kind of like your people who are just kind of standing on the outside. They're not really going to talk about slavery. Zachary Taylor is a slave owner himself, but he doesn't think that slavery's survival depends on its expansion. So they're like, it's fine. Like people who already have slavery, like it's going to still exist, like whatever. He's just like pretty laid back about it. Meanwhile, your free soilers are like, no slavery. And then, your Democrats are supporting popular sovereignty and talking about vetoing the Wilmot Proviso. So because the Democratic Party was split, there was more support for the Whigs, and General Zachary Taylor wins the election. So no biggie there. Then comes the Compromise of 1850. Here we go. So in 1850, we decide, we've got to do something. We've had all these issues with like the new territories, what they're going to decide with the new territories. California is going to be admitted to the Union as a free state. Popular sovereignty will be used to determine slavery in Utah and New Mexico territories. The Texas border dispute with New Mexico would be resolved because there's like obviously some territory that Texas is trying to claim that belongs to New Mexico. Texas is going to get $10 million in that sense, and we're going to kind of let that be. Slave trade, but not slavery itself, is going to be abolished in the District of Columbia. So you can still have slaves, but they're no longer like buying and selling slaves. And then you have a new stringent Fugitive Slave Law Act. And this fugitive slave law is really what leads to a lot more dissent against slavery. So here's a picture of the meeting here at the whenever they're creating the Compromise of 1850. Everyone's talking about, what we can do to appease the Northerners and Southerners. I don't see any windows in there, and they're all wearing these like big heavy suits. So I'm going to assume everybody's pretty hot, pretty tired, pretty sweaty, pretty ready to get over here and get out of there, get this all over with. So as a result of the Fugitive Slave Act, basically, if you were African American and you had escaped, a person claiming that an African American had escaped from slavery only had to point out a person and say that they were a runaway to take them back into custody. So basically, any like African American who lived in the North was in danger of being pointed out as a runaway slave because you're black, basically. Like just because you have this colored skin means that you're at risk now. You don't really have the freedom to just like walk around and not worry about somebody saying, "Hey, that's a runaway slave." There's actually a movie called 12 Years a Slave where the whole movie is about a man who is like captured by like these kidnappers, slave catchers, grab him, and like he had a family, he had a wife and 2 children, he had a job, like he was a hardworking man, and he's taken to the South and he literally lives as a slave for 12 years. And like they try to get him back, and like the court marshals and like the judges are just like, sorry, that guy says he's a slave, so he's definitely a slave. And so it takes him a while to get home. He does eventually get home, but that's not the case for all of these people. Most of the people who are kidnapped and taken into the South never see their families again. They're kidnapped and that is it. So another part of the Fugitive Slave Act that's really it's really disheartening. Federal commissioners would get $10 if they ruled in favor of slaveholders. Whereas if they ruled in favor of the accused runaway, they would only get $5. So if they're, money hungry, they're going to vote in favor of the slaveholders every time. Federal marshals are also ordered to assist slave catchers, and they could deputize citizens on the spot to help them capture fugitives. So if you're just standing on the street, whether you support slavery or not, you could be deputized on the spot and be told that you need to assist to help catch this slave or hold this slave for me. And if you refuse to, you would be jailed. So a lot of the Northerners who are against slavery start getting really, really upset about this particular act because they're being forced to help kidnap African Americans and send them back to slavery, and a lot of them don't necessarily agree with it. A lot of the newspaper accounts of the unjust seizure of African Americans fueled a lot of Northern dissent against slavery. So this is one of the posters that you might see in the North. This was from Boston. It says, "Caution, colored people of Boston, one and all." Basically, you need to watch out because there are kidnappers and there are slave catchers. If you don't keep a lookout and have an eye open, like you might be kidnapped and taken as a slave. If you value your liberty and your welfare, the fugitives among you, shun them in every possible manner. As so many hounds on the track, and most unfortunate of your race. Like, how unfortunate. So the Underground Railroad You have people like Henry David Thoreau who wrote about things like the Fugitive Slave Act, and he says, you know what, just because something is a law like the Fugitive Slave Act doesn't mean that you have to support it. If this law is immoral to you, you can disobey this law. And so a lot of people kind of start joining in with the Underground Railroad. You had to pay heavy fines, and you would even go to prison if you helped a runaway. But a lot of whites and free African Americans still continued to help work for the Underground Railroad into the 1830s. So conductors would help these runaways. They give them shelter, they give them food, they make sure that they could get to their northern states or even to Canada with money and a fresh start. One of the most famous conductors is Harriet Tubman, of course, but Levi Kaufman is another one who's very famous, and he supposedly allowed an estimated 2,000 African Americans to stop in his home on their way to freedom. And honestly, like, it's a risk. If you're a free white person and you are helping African Americans run away from slavery, you could be in just as much trouble as some of the slaves. It's a really risky business, but a lot of people, because they disagreed with the act of slavery morally, were willing to risk their own lives and their own freedom to help other people escape. So this is a quote from the Underground Railroad, and it says, this is Harriet Tubman over here to the right. It says, "We knew not what night or what hour of the night we would be roused from slumber by a gentle tap at the door. Outside in the colder rain there would be 2 horse wagons loaded with fugitives, perhaps the greater part of them women and children. I would invite them in a low tone to come in, and they would follow me into the darkened house without a word, for we knew not who might be watching and listening." And that's really important to keep in mind, because just because you were an abolitionist or you didn't support slavery doesn't mean that your neighbor was on the same side as you. So sometimes your neighbor might turn you in and say, "I saw so-and-so harboring slaves. So-and-so was allowing a group of slaves to come in," and your house could be searched at the drop of a hat. You just really had to be very careful and try not to cause too much of a disturbance. So basically, Uncle Tom's Cabin becomes one of the most popular books in the 1800s. It is written by Harriet Beecher Stowe because her sister, who lived in Boston, had seen a lot of kidnappings of African Americans and was upset about the Fugitive Slave Act. And so she writes her sister and says, "Look, there's a lot that I'd like to do about this, but honestly, I'm just not as talented as you. You are such a talented writer. If you could just write something to kind of like go towards this purpose, go towards this cause, I think it would make the world a difference." And so she writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it sells over 300,000 copies in the first year that it's out, which is like monumental for the time. Her depiction of enslaved hero Tom and the villainous overseer Simon Legree changed Northern perceptions of African Americans in slavery altogether. People who were unmoved by rational arguments against slavery saw this book or read this book and felt pity and outrage in how slaves were treated. Southerners tried very unsuccessfully, of course, to have the novel banned because they said that it was basically like a lie. The portrayal of slavery is outright just wrong. She's writing distortions and falsehoods. This can't be true. It had such a dramatic impact that many historians consider it to be one of the major causes of the Civil War. And I do believe that without Uncle Tom's Cabin, I think that we would have not had quite as much support against slavery, for sure. And, that would have made a difference in the Civil War. So here's Harriet Beecher Stowe here in her novel. Now we get to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and you're going to have to watch some of these videos on your own. You might have to pull up the PowerPoint and just click on the links to watch some of the videos about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and like the Dred Scott decision, and anytime you see a link. So Stephen Douglas had proposed to repeal the Missouri Compromise and allow Kansas to enter the Union as 2 separate territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and then allow the citizens of this territory to use popular sovereignty to determine if slavery would exist. Everyone basically thought that Kansas would be a slave state and Nebraska would be a free state. Northerners, of course, are irritated because they see this act as like a major betrayal. Slavery isn't going to be limited in the North like it was in the Missouri Compromise. And so you have a lot of people who get fired up over this. So if you look, this line is supposed to be where the Missouri Compromise is. And instead, you have because you have here, this is like our Missouri Compromise line here. Let's just imagine an imaginary line. Um, Kansas territory here is north of that line, and that's where slavery is probably going to exist. And then Nebraska is definitely north of that line. And if slavery exists in Nebraska, like that is a major kind of slap in the face for the Northerners who had thought this entire time that slavery would only exist north of that line in a couple of these states. So Kansas becomes the first battleground between those for and against slavery. The New England Immigrant Aid Society helped recruit and outfit slavery settlers bound for Kansas, or anti-slavery settlers bound for Kansas, because they're wanting as many anti-slavery people to get there as possible and settle as quickly as they can so that they can vote to not have slavery in Kansas. The Missouri Senator David Atchison basically says, if you're pro-slavery, you need to storm into Kansas and you need to make a difference now, or we're going to end up with a neighboring state, right next door to us that is a free state, like the Northerners are trying to get there before us. By March 1856, Kansas had two governments, a free government and a slave government. By May 21st, 1856, the border ruffians from Missouri had attacked the town of Lawrence, which basically was a stronghold of anti-slavery settlers. Bleeding Kansas, as the newspapers dubbed the territory, became the scene of a territorial Civil War battle between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. By the end of the year, over 200 people had died in fighting and $2 million worth of property had been destroyed. People were literally hacking people to death during this time. Like, if you were against slavery and you were that radical, you might hack someone to death, or you might be hacked to death by someone who is anti-slavery. And so it is just, it's a really terrible situation because this is not even the start of the Civil War yet. Like, we haven't even started. We're not really considered at war yet, but you still have Americans killing Americans over the issue of slavery, and burning buildings down, destroying property. So, yeah. Here's a picture of, like, a drawing of what this particular town would have looked like during Bleeding Kansas, or after the aftermath of Bleeding Kansas, once all the fighting had resided. So as a result of all of this, you get a split in the Whig Party because you have people in the North who oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Act because it's obviously against everything that they've stood for, and then you have Southerners who support the Kansas-Nebraska Act because it's allowing slavery to exist north of the Missouri Compromise line. So the Whig Party is now the Whigs and the Republican Party. So in the North, the Republican Party is named after Thomas Jefferson's original party. They want to revive the spirit of the American Revolution. And they are kind of like, cautious of Southern planters who are becoming an aristocracy that controlled the federal government. They're believing that the Southern planters are the ones who are like taking over the government and ruining everything basically with slavery. So the Republicans didn't agree on whether slavery should be abolished in the southern states, but they didn't want it to exist in the new territories. So they're not like staunch abolitionists of slavery in general. The Republicans just don't want it to exist in the new territories. The Democrat, James Buchanan, ends up winning the presidency in 1856 because obviously there's a split in the Whig Party. And so that party, the votes for that party are divided, and the Democrat is able to win the election. He's the best choice for preserving the Union at this point. He's not taking a stance on either way. Another really unfortunate event is the Dred Scott decision. In Dred Scott versus Sanford, Dred Scott was an enslaved man whose Missouri slaveholder had taken him to live in a free territory before returning to Missouri. So basically, like, we're going to live up north for a while. Like, he's considered free because he's in a free state. And then his master tries to take him back to Missouri, and he's like, no, I'm not going. And he sues his master to end his slavery, saying that he had spent all this time in the free territory and he was a free man. Scott's case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. Once it gets to the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roger Taney delivers the majority opinion and rules against Scott because African Americans were not citizen and therefore they couldn't sue in courts. What a slap in the face. Then Taney addresses the Missouri Compromise and say, just because they're like, let's talk about the ban on slavery in territory north of Missouri's border anyway. And they say, the Supreme Court said that the federal government could not prohibit slavery in the territories, and free soil was technically unconstitutional. And so everything that Chief Justice Roger Taney stands for is supporting the slavery sentiments in the South. He says, you know what? Doesn't matter. This man's not a citizen. He can't really necessarily be free. Also, slavery should be able to exist wherever it wants. Free soil is not, it's not constitutional. Sorry. And so this really outrages a lot of Northerners and kind of like drives the hatred for slavery even more. And here's Taney over here on the left, and then Dred Scott on the right. And there is an assignment. I'll have the assignment posted. I think I've already posted it actually for you guys on Canvas to complete. So here we get Abraham Lincoln. He's appealed to the Republican Party because they think he's going to be a strong nominee against Stephen Douglas. He stands up and he has this beautiful quote. It's very wise. It says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." We have slavery. You can't have slavery in the North or slavery in the South and no slavery in the North. He says, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided and it will become all of one thing or all of the other." He's not an abolitionist, but he definitely believes that slavery is morally wrong, and he opposes the existence of slavery and its spread into Western territories. So Lincoln and Douglas go up against each other. They're from the same state, and they're trying to decide who's going to run for president or who's going to run for the Republican Party. So Lincoln asked Douglas if the people of a territory could legally exclude slavery before achieving statehood. If he said yes, obviously he's going to lose Southern support. But if he says no, he's going to lose Northern support. So Lincoln tries to catch him. He's very he's very eloquent speaker, very insightful. And luckily, Douglas replies pretty well with the Freeport Doctrine. He says, I accept the Dred Scott ruling, but people can still keep slavery out by refusing to pass the laws needed to regulate and enforce it. And so, I'm not going to say one way or the other, but there's that. And he wins for his answers. He doesn't really take one stance or the other. But Lincoln created clear principles for a Republican Party, and he established a national reputation for himself as a man of clear, insightful thinking who could agree with force or argue with force and eloquence. So after Lincoln tries to run, we get a raid, John Brown's raid, in 1859. Basically, he believed that God had raised him up on purpose to break the jaws of the wicked. He is a very, very radical religious man, to the point where at Bleeding Kansas during that whole scenario, John Brown had he and his sons hacked to death a group of men who supported slavery, and this is all in the name of God. So he's a little different, a little out there. So on October 16th, 1859, him and 18 of his followers seize a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So what he's going to do is he's going to take all these weapons and he's going to free and arm all the enslaved people in the area and then start an insurrection against slaveholders. So he's trying to lead this big uprising of slaves against their slaveholders. He's caught pretty quickly. The U.S. Marines come down from Washington, D.C. pretty quickly to Harper's Ferry under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. And then 36 hours later, Brown's captured. And so it's definitely a disaster, but it just goes to show that, because he had killed people trying to get into the arsenal, he's willing to kill for the issue of slavery because he is against it and just so staunchly supports the abolitionist movement. Basically, John Brown, whenever it's time for him to be, executed, he's about to be sentenced to death. He says, "I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I've always freely admitted I've done on behalf of God's despised poor. I did no wrong but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done. And so John Brown's last words to the court are literally him saying, I don't regret anything that I've done. Like, this is all for God's glory. This is all for, the slaves who are being mistreated and this and that. And like, he lets everybody know he's not changing his mind. And he dies a martyr. Like, people literally see him as someone who has, like, died for a noble cause. So he's not Old Brown longer. He is an angel of light, says Henry David Thoreau of him. For Southerners, Brown's raid offered all the proof that they needed that Northerners are actively plotting to murder slaveholders. And so, like, the Southerners are starting to get a little, like, creeped out by the Northerners. Like, okay, y'all are supporting John Brown. He's trying to lead an uprising. He's trying to kill all these slaveholders. They're trying to kill us now. We need to really watch our backs. So Lincoln is elected he's nominated at the Republican convention because he had gained all this popularity during his debates with Stephen Douglas. Republicans basically try to say, like, they're not just an anti-slavery party. Like, we don't support John Brown. John Brown was a little out there. He's a little too radical for us. But we do support higher tariffs, a new homestead law for Western settlers, and the Transcontinental Railroad. And so a lot of the Republican proposals had angered Southerners, but the Democrat vote was split between Douglas and Breckinridge. So Lincoln won the election without any Southern support. Southerners viewed Lincoln's election as a victory for the abolitionists, and they were immediately, like, ready to secede because they saw Lincoln's election as a pro-slavery sentiment. They're like, no, this is it. We're done. We've got to get out of here. If he's president, he's talking about this House divided, can't stand. He's about to get rid of slavery. We got to get out of here. So South Carolina is the first state to secede, and then following South Carolina, February 1st, 1861, by February 1st, 1861, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas follow. Secession is in tradition of the American Revolution. They're fighting for their rights. You got to keep in mind, like, they're making connections here. They're saying, you know what, we're fighting for something that we literally believe in. Lincoln is a tyrannical dictator who is trying to take away our livelihood, and we don't agree with that. And so you have to see it from their perspective as well. So Southerners began seizing all federal property, including arsenals and forts, except for Fort Sumter at Charleston and Fort Pickens at Pensacola. Crittenden's compromise basically says, like, John Crittenden is trying to, like, get everybody back together. He's like, please, like, everybody, we can all still be friends. He says, let's propose some amendments to the Constitution to guarantee slavery where it already exists, and we can reinstate the Missouri Compromise line and extend it to the California border. Lincoln's like, no, the amendment doesn't pass. Virginia then tries to propose a peace conference to make similar compromises. Congress still refuses to pass it. Lincoln's like, I'm sorry, it's all or nothing. I'm not doing this. Like, we're not going to do compromises anymore. Compromises have only led us to bloodshed. And he's right, like, there's nothing else that you can do. And so that's how we get the United States of America and the Confederate States of America. And you have some border states here. Look at these here border states, Missouri and Kentucky. Like, they're not necessarily one way or the other just yet. So seceding states met in Montgomery, Alabama in February, and they declared themselves the Confederate States of America. The convention drafted a constitution based largely on the U.S. Constitution, with the exception of ensuring that each state had independence and guaranteed the existence of slavery in the Confederate territory. It banned the importation of slaves, protected tariffs, and limited the presidency to a single 6-year term. Jefferson Davis was chosen as president of the Confederate States of America. So the Civil War hasn't begun yet. Like, everybody's just seceding right now. The Civil War actually begins in 1861 at Fort Sumter. So Lincoln promises to hold, occupy, and possess all federal property. And keep in mind, the southern states had already been seizing federal property. Lincoln announced in March to resupply Fort Sumter because he wanted Fort Sumter to still be a part of the United States. He's like, that's not theirs. That is a federal fort, and it belongs to us. President Jefferson Davis had to decide whether to allow federal troops to occupy the South's most vital harbor or fire on the supply ship, which would obviously lead to war. So Davis decides to capture Fort Sumter before the supply ship arrives to try to preserve peace. He's like, that way, like, we'll have people at the fort, like, we won't have to worry about the supply ship or shooting the supply ship, like, we'll just already be there. Confederate forces fired cannons and bombarded Fort Sumter until Union forces surrender. And that is when the Civil War officially began. They end up having to fire cannons and, whatever anyway. So this is Fort Sumter now, as a present day picture. And here we have President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to serve in the military for 90 days. The Upper South states did not want to secede from the Union, but they also didn't want to fight in a civil war because they'd literally be fighting like brothers, cousins, uncles, like whatever family members like that were in the South. And they still, support slavery. They're like, sorry, we don't really want to fight in this cause. We don't want in this. So they believe they had no choice but to secede from the Union. Virginia passed the Ordinance of Secession first, followed by Arkansas, then North Carolina, and Tennessee. So the Confederate Congress moved the capital of the Confederacy to Richmond, Virginia. It's pretty close north. To prevent Maryland secession, Lincoln imposed martial law in Baltimore, where mobs had already attacked federal troops. Kentucky's Ohio River was strategically important to the Union, and so whenever Kentucky seceded at the invasion of the Confederate and the Union forces in the territory, it causes like a split in Kentucky government. There's two different governments now. And then in Missouri stays with the Union with support from federal forces. And then you have the preservation of the Union that is shifted to the battlefield. They're like, okay, the only way to really do this now is to fight it out. So river systems are really important when looking at battling. And you see this is the Ohio River that we're talking about. That's like really strategically important to like transporting goods and soldiers and such. So is that it? Okay, I think that's it. So So the next section will be the actual Civil War, and we'll talk more about the battles and such from there. So sit tight, make sure you've got your notes situated, and make sure you're turning your assignments in. Look under modules frequently.